compliance. My name is Ryan Castle. I'm with Tracesecurity. The goal for today is to give you a high-level overview of ADA compliance as it relates to websites. ADA compliance is obviously a difficult, timely, and nuanced topic, so we're just going to try and get a high-level overview of some of the common things that we encounter, some of the common problems we face, and how those can be fixed. Quick background about ADA. ADA stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to focus on subchapter 3 today, which has to do with public accommodations and services operated by private entities. And the key phrase here is public accommodation. This has been generally accepted to apply to websites as well. The ADA Act was passed in the early 90s, obviously at the infancy of the internet. It wasn't really initially designed for this kind of thing. Really more designed for things like building access and having ramps, but has been since modified and expanded to include websites. So at its core, your website needs to follow certain accessibility standards to allow access for those with disabilities. Before we get into some of the topics, I want to quickly go over Tracesecurity's methodology. Our methodology for this is very much in line with our methodology for doing security assessment work. Above all, we want our solutions to be practical. Each organization has different needs, different resources to bear, and different budgets to deal with. We want to make sure that any solution we provide is going to be practical for you. Again, borrowing from our security practice, we want to start by identifying the greatest threats and risk and working on fixing those issues first, working our way down as we eliminate the risks in a methodical fashion. And obviously, we want to have an eye towards the rest of your organization and its overall strategy. We don't want to look at this in a vacuum and say, we only want to address the ADA findings and every single one of them. We want to be thoughtful about your entire organization. We're talking about ADA web compliance. We want to make these websites accessible to users that have disabilities. What do those disabilities look like from a web usability standpoint? Folks with limited or no vision, limited or no hearing, and lastly, limited dexterity. So for those people, there are different technologies that they're going to be using to access the web. For people with vision impairment, there's screen reader technology that effectively reads the web page to you. People with limited hearing or no hearing, there's going to be things like closed captioning of any audio you might have. And then for dexterity, there are special keyboards that people can use. Some people may not have the ability to operate a mouse, so different way that they browse a website than you might as someone who can use a mouse or a full-size keyboard. How does being non-compliant or having findings affect you and your business individually? We kind of hear three main categories. One is obviously just losing business. You can turn away any potential customers if they're unable to access your site, review your offerings, or submit forms on your web page. You can also have people that file a complaint with the DOJ. So if there's an issue trying to access one of your sites, can file a complaint. And lastly, we've seen an uptick in the legal threat where there's certain attorneys or law firms out there actually targeting organizations and sending or threatening to send legal action for non-compliance to the standard. And so all those, again, are looking at those public-facing websites, and we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the tools that we can use to evaluate that threat. So how can I prevent this? Again, we took a page from our security practice and kind of look at it as 3 steps here. So the first thing we want to do is assess the current situation. Once we do that, we're going to identify any gaps, any findings that we may have. Let's take those and prioritize them. And again, the prioritization is going to go towards that threat risk model as well as fitting within the organizational needs. Take those and prioritize them. And lastly, we're going to remediate those things and send them off. But again, we want to have an eye towards being practical here. So doing an entire website rewrite is really not practical for most people. So how can we identify a few of the key things that are easy to fix, that are low risk, and get those things done, and then reassess and evaluate where we stand from that standpoint. A few things about the actual assessment phase of this. One thing that's important to remember is the actual code that is used to develop your website is much more important than the actual visual representation. So even though things may look correct on a page and be laid out correctly and make sense to you visually. For things like screen reader technology in particular, what really matters is the underlying code. And so you may have a page that looks identical. One is very accessible, friendly to screen readers. One may be totally unusable, that by just looking at the web page, you can't really tell. So we'll get into some of those technologies and how to determine those things. And lastly, when we do this assessment, or if you're doing your own assessment, is to really consider what is the acronym WCAG, which stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And what this really defines the specification for making your website compliant. That's going to identify the things that you really need to do in order to make the page compliant. And when it's not, it's going to also give you a pretty good idea of a recommendation and a way to fix that. So that's the standard that's pretty much accepted across the country. Is going to be the best place, the best resource for you to go in terms of assessing and remediating things you find on your site. When we do the assessment phase, a lot of the things that we commonly encounter, here's kind of our top 4, I guess, although they tend to cross categories. One of them falls into that category of how the code is actually much more important than the actual visual representation of the site. So in website navigation, you think about how most web pages are laid out. You have some kind of navigation bar along the top, probably with some menus and some titles there. You may have some sort of menu along the left-hand or right-hand side of your page. You've got some kind of hierarchical outline. You have your content in the middle. Maybe you have a form to fill out that has first name, last name, email, phone number, date of birth, that kind of thing. So that visual layout makes a lot of sense to you when you look at the page, but behind the scenes in the code, there may not be that consistent navigation. Things may jump around. And so that's something that, again, looking at the actual page layout may not be obvious, but when you actually examine the code, you're able to identify that, hey, the layout of this is not conducive to someone who's using a screen reader, because that technology is going to effectively read the code out to them, and if the order doesn't make sense, it's not going to make sense to someone using that technology. Another common finding we see is related to color contrast. This one's a little bit trickier. Basically it's talking about light text on a light background or dark text on a dark background. The WCAG defines certain acceptable levels of contrast for colors depending on font size and emphasis on the text. And we found that some folks, some portions of sites do not satisfy that minimum color contrast requirement. The reason this tends to be trickier is that this kind of goes beyond just technical changes and goes into branding questions. What we have found is that there are usually some pretty suitable slight shade changes that will make the contrast work in terms of minimum contrast and are really undiscernible to the naked eye. But again, that comes down to more of a branding question to make sure that are these color changes consistent with your brand. Another one that we see a lot of is automatic scrolling elements. In web parlance, this is the carousel. So, you go to most web pages, kind of the first thing you'll see is a big picture, an image. It's got some kind of offer, talking about a service or something. And these images will sort of scroll and filter through left to right usually, or right to left. And one of the common needs here is the ability to navigate and pause those elements. So for people that are, have visual impairment or using a screen reader, if they don't have time to actually read through the content of that before it scrolls away, it's obviously a frustrating and bad user experience. So you want to make sure you have those controls in place to actually pause and stop some of those elements from moving. And the last item here is probably the most common finding, and thankfully is obviously that one of the easier to fix. And this is making sure that everything on your site has an actual textual representation. So an easy example of this is images and pictures. A screen reader is unable to actually view an image and describe what it's seeing. So for any image element on a site, you want to make sure that you have some kind of alternative textual representation, and that when a user using that screen reader technology encounters that, they can be read out the description of what that is there. So we see that with images, we see that with links, we see that with buttons and a few other web elements that to someone viewing your page, it makes sense, but when using a screen reader technology, it's hard to navigate. And Thankfully, those things are pretty easy to fix. The HTML specification allows for some pretty easy fields to drop into your site that are going to make you pass this finding. We also encounter a lot of issues on forms, so this will be anything from your typical contact us form to submitting payment information online, basically any place where a user is inputting information into your page. One of the common findings, again, kind of has to do with that textual representation, is each of the form elements needs to have a logical name in the code. So while your page layout may say username colon and then have a field to type in a username and password colon and a place to type in the password, you want to make sure those actual input elements have a logical name. So if it says something like field 1 and field 2, someone using assistive technology is not going to know that field 1 means username and field 2 means password. So again, the nice thing here is HTML specification makes it pretty easy to add these things in. And there are some tools and some pretty easy checks that are available for you to go through and ensure that you're actually meeting that requirement. Another one we see sometimes is any field that has a timeout. For people using assistive technologies, it takes them longer to fill out forms. And so usually you want to make sure for anything that requires a timeout that you have the ability for someone to pause or extend that timeout so they can continue filling out their form. Another thing that we see on occasion, don't have listed here, but there are obviously some special protections you want to take on any time you're dealing with financial data or health data or any kind of irreversible action. So things like transferring funds. You want to make sure that there is ample explanation of what the user is about to do, particularly around timeouts and things like that, to make sure that someone using assistive technology understands that they're getting ready to make some irreversible action. They understand exactly what's happening and that they have sufficient time to make that decision. So again, for things where you're dealing with financial transactions, particularly that comes into play. So I've kind of talked through this, but probably a little bit more illustrative to use some examples here and pull up a web page. So I've developed a very unattractive but simple website with a few findings on it to kind of walk you through the tools we use or you can use and some of the ways to actually fix this stuff. So here's an example of a, again, very basic and not terribly attractive website with your nav bar along the top with some menu options, a little site search bar. We have some text content, a button and a picture, and some other things here. So a few things to note, first of all, is that this is what you see when you pull up the browser. What screen readers or what someone with assistive technology would see is something more like this, which does not look at all very attractive, but is what actually is happening behind the scenes. So this is where most of your fixes are going to occur, is actually in this code content, because you're not going to see a lot of the changes here in the website. So a few of the things that we can see just from looking at this is we talk about here, says click the blue button to learn more, and we have this blue button here. So people with visual impairment or color blindness may not be able to identify the blue button, and so you don't want to rely strictly on color elements or image elements to convey some information. So we want to make some changes there. Additionally, if you want to do your own assessment, you can pretty much go to Google, and there are any number of freely available tools to give you a rough pass of how your site is doing. One of the things to note about this is a great way to get a high-level overview. It identifies a lot of the things we're talking about, but it can identify this kind of thing to say, hey, you're talking about a blue button, but I don't know which blue button it is. So you can't rely purely on these automated tools, but I have one here on my browser called WAVE, the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. And this will, again, look at that code, look at what a screen reader would see, and identify things for you to evaluate. So I've put in 3 errors here. One of them is complaining about this button, that we have this empty link. There's not a descriptive link as to what this button does. My image here of a tree actually does not have an alternative text, so we're missing alternative text for this image. And lastly, this form doesn't have a label. So we see that there is search here. It's obvious to anyone viewing the page, this is a search bar, but that code element is missing, identifying to someone that, hey, this is actually a place to do a search. So in code, what this looks like is a few different things. So here is our example of the button with not a meaningful link and no text in it. So we can add in here between these 2 link tags some text to say, hey, this is actually our Learn More button. Now we've added some Learn More field here, so someone using assistive technology will know now this button is a way for me to learn more about this offering here above. Our other finding had to do with this image of a tree. Here we just show that it's a link to this tree.jpg. Simple change here. We add in a brief description of what this is. Now someone using assistive technology will say, you've encountered an image on the page. This image is a picture of a tree. Last element here was our search bar up top. It was not made clear. This is actually a place to search. And again, these changes are pretty simple to make. We're going to add in this ARIA label attribute, which again is something that a screen reader knows to actually read this out to someone visiting the site. So if we pull up this page again and rerun our tool, we've gotten down to our 0 errors here. Now we have this label for search site. We have this alternative descriptive text here of a picture of a tree, and we've described the meaning of this button. The last thing I wanted to run through in terms of example was a form. So again, in talking about how the code matters more, that here we see a logical layout of this form and of this navigation menu. People that don't have the ability to use a mouse are going to end up doing tabbing through your website. And so I've on purpose broken the tab order here to show you what this would look like. But when I hit my tab key the first time, you'll see that this example text area is highlighted in blue. So this is my first stop. My second stop here is this example select. Third, I'm at email address. 4, I'm in this field. Now 5, I'm up here in the window in my nav bar. I come over to the search. And finally, I hit submit here. So you can tell that the tab order does not match the actual order that you want in the page. And so again, for most sites, this actually works out of the box. I've actually on purpose gone through and broken it just for the purpose of this demo. But this tab index field is one that we've seen some people have modified to make tabbing maybe more intuitive, but can also throw off the standard order of the page. So someone with some web development background, or if you have maybe a partner that handles your web page, is something they should be able to handle, but a common thing that we see. The other item I'll point out is that some of these tools don't find this kind of thing. So in this case, this tool doesn't identify the fact that the tab order is out of place. So can't rely purely on those tools. Lastly, another thing that's an advantage here is so much of websites now is reused content. So for example, this header nav bar here is present on this home page in this form. We had that problem with the search bar not having an accessibly friendly name. When you change that in one place, that's going to work throughout your entire site. So sometimes running these tools will identify lots and lots of findings. Many times those findings are actually just appear on a single element that's repeated throughout your site. And so it may feel overwhelming at first to say, my gosh, we have hundreds of findings. In reality, you have to go fix something in one single place, and you've actually addressed it throughout your entire site. So again, we went through some of these common fixes. The WCAG specification is a great place to go for what are the accessibility guidelines and what are the common fixes. It'll outline all the different ways to address this. I showed, one way to add alternative text to an image, one way to add accessible friendly label to an input form. In truth, the specification allows for numerous different ways, so there's not just one way to do this. That specification can help you. Most of these things, again, depending on if you have an in-house web development staff, if you maintain your website internally or externally, but someone who maintains a website knows a little bit of HTML. Most of the common fixes should be pretty easy for them to accomplish. And the other thing that's nice about this is the majority of these fixes, again, you don't see on the visual representation of the page. They're pretty low-risk things to change. So when you add in alternative text to an image, you don't really run that risk of bringing your website down or having this very broken user experience. So those things are typically pretty low risk to roll out. Obviously, this is much easier to do if you're actually building out your site from scratch versus coming in and fixing it after the fact. But again, not terribly difficult to modify an existing site. We do make a distinction between what we call an ADA assessment versus an audit. What we determined to be an assessment is roughly what we've kind of discussed and outlined today. So running some automated tools, reviewing the code, manually running through the site using the browser to identify some of those common findings. what we term to be an audit would be someone actually using the assistive technology to run through and examine every component of your website, make sure that every part is usable. Obviously, that's much more involved, much more in depth, and is going to give you a much better picture of how someone with an accessible technology would experience your site. Again, the good news is for web technologies, because of the HTML specification, because of how most modern browsers work, a lot of those assistive technologies are just going to follow that specification. And so you're going to be able to identify the vast majority of issues through some of these automated tools and through an assessment, as opposed to do a full-on audit, but there is some distinction there. In the WCAG guidelines, they talk about the non-accessible content. And so we tend to say, listen, if there is a way for someone using accessible tools to accomplish this on your website, you are effectively good for ADA compliance. As the WCAG defines it, they say that pages may have non-accessibly supported content as long as that content is available in other places in an accessible format, and that the non-accessible content does not interfere with it. So, what this means is that every single element and item of your page does not have to be accessibility friendly, as long as all of the content on your site is available in some accessible way. That's how the WCAG defines it. And lastly, in wanting to be practical, we really want to do this in relation to your business's strategic goals, your customer base, time to implement, resources, cost to you. All those factors are important in running your business. This is one component of it. What level of remediation involvement is going to be practical for your business? Are you potentially missing out on some kind of market if you do or don't implement these features? Will it help with customer retention? And again, if you're looking at potentially having a big website overhaul or change, it might be best to wait until that time period to implement a lot of this and to go back and try and retrofit your existing site. But I hope that we've been able to kind of outline the high-level aspects of what people look for in an ADA audit, what some of the common findings are, and some of the typical issues we encounter and how to remediate them, taking a little bit of mystery out of the whole process for you.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, thanks so much for that presentation. Hope it was informative for everybody. Now is the time for questions. Feel free to send them over to us via the Q&A panel or the chat. And it looks like we actually have one right now. Ryan, does ADA compliance apply to mobile applications? So if they have something that they use for their business, or phones or tablets?
Sure. So ultimately, yes, it can. Does it apply? It's kind of a legal question. Again, we got talking about that publicly accessible. That's more of a question for you and your attorneys to decide, but are there accessibility guidelines for mobile applications? Yes, there are. Certainly to what we call native mobile applications. So these would be applications that are built specifically to run on Apple, iOS, or Google's Android operating system. The good news is, similar to the HTML specification, if you're developing it on the iOS or Android, what's called API, programming interface, those operating systems or those APIs provide by default a lot of the accessibility needs. So if you've been using those technologies, the good news is that it's a very high likelihood that your application is already accessibly friendly or very close to it. So you should be okay in that regard.
Okay. Looks like we've got another one. Somebody's saying they've heard there are different levels of ADA compliance. Can you do sort of a brief overview of what the levels are?
Sure. So WCAG, again, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, have defined 3 separate conformance levels that they've deemed A, AA, and AAA. Each of them are defined in the order of increasing levels of accessibility. The WCAG recommends people to achieve and aim for that level AA conformance. The WCAG basically says on their site that there are certain types of content that is literally impossible to meet to satisfy the level 3 requirement. So we tend to, when we do our own assessments, that the goal that the WCAG has defined that we try and meet is, let's evaluate the site against that AA level of conformance. And if you're doing that, you're in a very good position in terms of ADA compliance and making sure that your site is accessible.
How much effort is required to fix these things? And I assume by fix these things, they mean, fix the website, right? How much effort is required to make it ADA compliant?
What we found is the the majority of things that we found, and that we kind of highlighted them in the presentation, is those are typically not very much effort. I mean, obviously it depends on the findings on your website, how your website is structured. There's obviously some variability here. Most of the things, because they fit into the HTML specification, because browsers are built to support a lot of this those accessibility standards, is pretty minor changes to your website. So again, someone who's got a little bit of web development experience, or someone who is managing your website for you, should be able to take the recommendations that these tools generate and be able to take them and then apply them to your website. It's certainly not the level of doing an entire website rewrite. It's certainly not the level of adding new features to a software product. So certainly below that level of effort. What we found again is a lot of the low-hanging fruit type things are very, very quick to fix. And so that's usually a good place to start, and then kind of work your way down the list in terms of increasing difficulty. But most of them have to do with just adding some fields to the code that you don't see on your website, but is important for screen readers.
And then to piggyback off that, we actually had one asking about if they need to redo the colors on their website. What kind of color changes can they expect? Are they looking to like completely redo? You know, if they have a brand, are they redoing that completely, or?
No, so you definitely does not require what we've seen a complete brand redo. Much like those accessibility tools, you can just run a Google search for accessibility color contrast checker, and there's a lot of tools available where you can provide colors that will show you whether the contrast meets the WCAG guideline at level A or AA. Additionally, some of the tools will actually provide you with recommendations in the event that the color contrast is insufficient. It'll give you some very close colors that tend to match the colors that you provided, but actually meet the contrast requirement. And what we found is these tools are actually pretty good at finding color that is consistent with someone's brand, but is just a slight variation of shade that therefore meets the requirement. We very rarely find, we very rarely find where text is so out of whack in contrast that there's not a close approximation that can be met. So the reason that one tends to be more difficult is just because you want to be consistent to your brand, and sometimes those slight shade changes are actually very, can be interpreted as very severe. So it's a little bit trickier, whereas it's pretty easy to say, add some alternative text to this image and you've solved it. Fixing color contrast tends to be a little bit more difficult than just a purely technical problem.
Okay, so this question is interesting. When would you suggest that somebody does an assessment versus when should they do a ADA compliant audit?
I think it would be highly dependent upon your business needs. I would certainly not recommend that someone do the full-out audit first, where someone is using the assistive technology to actually browse your entire site before doing an assessment. Certainly an audit of that level is going to be much more involved and probably pricier. So it's easy enough to, again, you can run some of these free tools yourself, or to find someone who can conduct that assessment and give you those recommendations. And at a minimum, those problems are going to pop up in an audit as well, so you might as well address those first when they're easier to identify. And again, a lot of it depends on your business. If your business is specifically catering or have a large customer base that is going to be using assistive technologies, then it's obviously critical that each and every element of your website is examined and that it's fully usable for someone that's using those technologies. If, on the other hand, you want to make sure that it's accessible and usable, but it may not be the entire customer base, that maybe you don't, maybe the assessment is going to be sufficient enough to where, hey, there is a single way to do this. The content is accessible through single means, and so that's enough for my business. But it tends to be more of an individual business decision. But again, I certainly would not. I would keep the order as assessment first, followed by audit, not vice versa.
Okay, so we got one more that just came in. Guess we'll go ahead and make this our last one. So the question is, where else do I need to look out for ADA compliance aside from just the website?
So again, some of this goes back to that legal definition of public accommodation. The places that we have seen, so obviously your physical structure, right, things like ramps, we're not going to really touch on that, but from a technical standpoint, public-facing website is obviously the way focused on here, probably the most important, and I would say is a pretty safe assumption to be deemed a public accommodation. We see this, obviously we talked a little about mobile applications earlier, so mobile apps are another place to look. Another place that we've seen people having a need is actually on web, what we call a web application. So maybe you have a public-facing website, but you also have a portal that your customers or your members can log into and take in certain functions. Those portals tend to be a lot more interactive, whereas a website tends to be very read-only. There's not a whole lot of user input. Web applications tend to obviously involve a lot more user input. So if you're transacting on business, doing financial transactions, making blog posts, whatever those things are inside of that member-specific, customer-specific portal, obviously a little bit more involved assessment there because there's a lot more to evaluate and a lot more usability concerns, because as opposed to just having a screen reader that's going to read, you're going to have a lot more interaction with your site. So another place to look out for would be this custom, maybe you have a custom or a web application you have for your customers, would be another place to be aware of potential ADA compliance needs.
Okay, well, we look like we're out of questions. I want to go ahead and thank Ryan for taking the time to talk to us about ADA compliance. Appreciate it, Ryan.
Absolutely.
And thank everybody for joining us. We will see you guys next time. Thanks again.